Hello and welcome to another advancing episode. This one's going to be on state machines with activity diagrams. We've done a lot of videos on state machines. We've shown you how to create state machines from scratch. We've shown how to build them from scenarios. Back and forth, we've shown you how to simulate state machines, even how to code for that simulation. We've shown you how to build out activity diagrams, and following the same approaches we use for building out state machines. You can do them from scenarios, which I prefer to do when I'm doing analysis of requirements or refactoring code or systems. And I like to use scenarios in many cases because I can auto-generate other diagrams to carry forward design and collaboration. However, in this episode, we are going to focus on building a state machine from scratch. I'm going to try to keep this video as short as possible, so I've actually built a lot of the content out ahead, and I'm just going to step through what I did. And if you want to reflect back on those other videos, whether it's state machines or it's activity diagrams, I've included the links in the description below. So let's get started. So as usual, I work in my local environment on a specific project only for design, right? So I always start with a main folder that defaults on the landing page so I can able to pick up quickly on my work because there's a lot of interruptions throughout the day. So then I create incoming building blocks, input building blocks, and essentially what these are, so I'm bringing in either elements, design elements, refactored elements from real code as we're going forward, as well as other architecture. I also am able to build out some context elements that we're going to use in our scenarios as we're going through. And these are usually picked up when we're reading the business requirements or functional requirements, non-functional requirements, nouns and verbs. So I'm able to quickly get to the things that I want to talk about. Today, we're going to be focused on the startup class element, trying to keep this short and simple. And we're going to build out a state machine for that particular service, that class, if you will. This is a startup class, as well as an activity diagram. I want to show both approaches because you can start on any side of the spectrum when it comes to computer-aided software engineering and UML. So here, my main landing page becomes my canvas to paint my design. So I brought in the startup element. We had some code that we could actually work with that we're going to refactor in this design. So we were fortunate enough for that. Otherwise, you can just start and build out your own class elements based off the nouns and verbs that you're using for design. Now, you can start with a state machine diagram or an activity diagram. And the purpose of these essentially is the state machine models the lifecycle of an object. So when we're invoking a particular class, we're creating an object that's going to be used in session. And in this particular approach, we want to show the transitions from one state to another. So, for example, when you're looking at code, you can see that each one of these invocations, each one of these methods represents a particular state that the code, the application, the platform is going to be in during running, right? And then we might need to use an activity diagram to represent the flow of activities in a process workflow or even algorithm. And later on, we're going to be getting into algorithms as we start designing machine learning and working in data science. But the activity diagram gives us the ability, especially if we're using scenarios, to accomplish specific objectives. If we're going through a particular activity diagram. Here we have the activity, and here we have actions that are within it. And we want to talk about the configuration service. So we're able to go in here, take a scenario, build out the scenario, and then do lots of things. For example, we can generate sequence diagrams. We can generate other activity diagrams. We can even drill down into state diagrams where we may have states within states. We can generate test cases and so much more. So the scenarios becomes an extremely powerful tool. You don't have to use it. For example, you could do a particular action and you want to show using a sequence diagram. You can go out and create that represents, hey, from startup, we're going to call configuration services so that we're able to register particular services during the invocation. And you can do that when you get to, all right, we've done that. Now let's call a configuration. So from the startup, what we're trying to do now is add in our middleware, our middle services to our particular function call, method invocation, in order to understand the design as we're going forward. So you have so many options. You can go back and forth between state machines and activity diagrams in order to accomplish your design, development, and implementation, as well as testing strategies. So how we got started, just as I stated, we chose a class element we're going to start with, and we need to refactor this class element. Code already exists to support the API that we're developing. So we create a workspace where we're able to take the startup, understand the methods that are being called within that startup, any attributes or properties. And then from here, what we can do is we can right click on this, go to new child diagram. We're going to create a composite, and then you can come down here in Sparks and choose, well, I want to do an activity diagram, or I want to do a state machine diagram. And you select that and it builds out the tooling and the diagram. It would be blank in this case to get started. And it gives you the state machine dialog to work inside to start explaining your state machine. So I typically will put the steps in that I want to build the state machine around, and then I start adding in those states. So just as you learn in those other videos, I always start with an initial state and I always add in a final state because I know I have to start and I have to stop. And then what I'm doing here is I'm adding in my first state, and this is for startup. And I might explain what's going on in this particular state machine as we're going through, and I can go to properties and I might start typing in, hey, this is application, it's the initial state for startup, and the event is startup is instantiated, and the transition that you see here is reads configuration. So now that I've explained what startup is, I start to put in the transition, right? And in this particular case, I think I have alias turned on. Let me turn alias off. And then you can just use human phrases with spaces, or you can get as technical as you want, right? So in this particular case, what I'm doing is reads configuration. So I call this state service configuration. And within it, I need to check the environment. What's the environment that we're operating in? And if it's development, I'm not interested in that. I can create other states for that. But in this particular case, you're going to see when we get to simulation, we just end the application and shut it down. We're going to throw an exception page that's useful to the particular user. It may be testers, it may be your clients that are paying for the project. And if it's out there, if you're not careful in configuration, your customers are going to get an exception. What do you mean I'm in development? Now they shouldn't get that because you're going to be in the production environment, right? And then from service configuration, once that's completed, I go into pipeline configuration. And this is a particular area within the code that I essentially will throw the exception and end, or I will start adding in the middleware such as redirection and routing. Then once I'm completed there, I move down to, hey, everything was successful. The application is running. We can exit startup and we can go on to the next state or portion of the system and software that you're operating in. Now let me zoom out a little bit here on this so I can see the entire model. And let's go ahead and run simulation. So I'm just right-clicking anywhere here and execute simulation. I'm going to do manual because I did not make this interpretive, and we're going to go ahead and run it. So it's coming through, it goes through the startup, and it gets to the service configuration. And at this particular case, I can throw an exception, or I can go right to pipeline. We're going to go right to the pipeline, and it's going to run through. And as soon as it gets here, it has some other decisions to make, whether, hey, we want to go right to application running, or we want to use the exception page. We're going to throw an exception. And that output would come from service configuration. So what we're going to do is move to application running, and it's going to run through and set up the environment, configure the pipeline, bring in the middleware, and start running the application, and you can see it ends. So I go to our simulation workspace layout. It makes it a little bit easier to roll through it. And so let me just zoom out a little bit here on this just to see this. And you can see this is from the previous simulation we just ran. We can clear the results, or as soon as we start running it again, and we're using manual, and you learn all of this in previous videos, we're going to go ahead and run it. You can see it cleared it. It's stepping you through the simulation as it's going forward, and we're going to move to configuration. There we go. And we're going to run to the end after we get through with configuring our middleware services. Simulation is ended. If I run it again, let's go ahead and just run it again. In this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to test our design, check environment, and it's going to go through check environment, state of state, show you how that operates, and we can now move to pipeline. Everything's working so far, and we're going to throw an exception because we're in the development environment. And what we're going to do is we're in a development environment. That's the particular state. And we're going to, from the development exception or execution, whatever you named this state, it is going to run to shut down, and it has ended. And here it gives you kind of an audit trail as you're going through and understanding your state machine. Let's go back to our common workspace layout. Right. Normally I have multiple monitors going so I can have all these out there. And then what we're going to do is talk about how you get started. So in this particular case, I happen to have code, but a lot of cases you don't have code, and you might just have the skeleton framework of your pseudocode that you're working from. So you start to understand, all right, I'm invoking startup. I'm in this startup state. It's initial, it's idle as it's going forward. And then various actions are triggered, such as, hey, go ahead and start startup, start setting up for configuration, call configuration, register your connections, your repository, your controllers. When we get to I web host environment and I application builder. So it's going in here, hey, if development. So as you're doing design, you can build out your assumptions in your pseudocode, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So here we're in a real project as we're working through. This is our actually fictitious project for all the videos we're making on model-driven anything. And solution architect is working with the design application architect. And as we're getting in, we're going into the various code elements that we want to look at. In this particular case, we're working on the design for the repository. We have not brought in the design for refactoring the startup class or functions. And you can see this is pseudocode. So we're just going through and we're explaining what each one of the classes are going to be in their various states as they're working through. So this is how you basically can start accumulating the nouns and verbs as you're moving into further design. Let's get back over to our state machine diagram, and let's pretend for a moment that we're working with application architects, the actual developers, and we're trying to explain our state machine. So if you get to a particular area where it's checking environment, you're registering various components, like I stated before, you can explain your states within a state using state machine, just simply by, all right, well, let's talk about check environment. And you can come in here and you can add a composite diagram for states, or you can start building out and connecting to your sequence diagrams, which is another behavior diagram. And in this particular case, we generated this from a activity diagram, right? So when we're looking at this, if I right click on this, I can go to properties here, or I can double click on this action and get the properties, go to scenarios, and we built out a scenario that steps through what we're doing in registering these components. And then from here, if we did this right, and you learn this in other videos, and this is why I brought in certain context to help set up to build a sequence diagram. So I can select sequence diagram and it'll auto-generate this sequence diagram. And then here we can further collaborate, whether we're all together in a conference call or we're working offline together and we're simply right-clicking items and, hey, I want to talk about or discuss or review this particular object or element within your models. So it's very quick and easy to take activity diagrams and the actions in them, generate scenarios from those, and then generate other models that you want to use to talk through, validate, or justify the architecture that you're presenting to the team, right? So in this particular case, we're able to have a conversation about configuring our middleware or doing other things during the configuration services call, right? So activity diagrams start to become very powerful when you're modeling your architecture from various viewpoints, whether they're activities in here. This is the activity. These are the actions that are within the activity. And then I'm just simply putting in a composite hyperlink. And when I drag it into an activity diagram, it turns into this element that you see here that allows us to get to particular conversations. All right. So here is where we're mixing state machines in conversation to talk about transitions from one state to another. And we're introducing activity diagrams to step through the flow of activities in a process, right? And in this particular case, it's the processing relevant to startup. So that's state machines with activity diagrams. We could certainly use activity diagrams and generate state machines, that whether you're using scenarios or you're building them from scratch separately and then introducing them as composite elements linked. So we're able to step through our state machine, we're able to explain our state machine, and we're able to drill down into specific states, if you will, using other behavioral references to understand and collaborate on our designs, our implementations, and our actual code implementation and testing. That's going to conclude this session. Thanks so very much for watching. I hope it was helpful for you. And if you have any questions or concerns, please post them down below, especially if you don't agree or you have a better approach that you like to use during your system and software design. Until that next episode, happy modeling.